Welcome to Theory and Practice,
a podcast dedicated to decoding research in the field of speech-language pathology.
This is Sarah.
And this is John. We're both SLPs delving into research and
equipping you with evidence-based practices and empower you to provide the highest quality care for your clients.
As a disclaimer, this is just our personal opinions and thoughts. It's not meant to misinform or claim the intentions of the literature or publication. We also encourage you to read and interpret the findings independently.
Hi, John.
Hi, Sarah. How are you?
I'm good. So we're kicking off season 2 today. And it's the summer of 2024. So tell me what's been going on so far. I haven't spoken to you for a while. Let me know.
That's right. Well, I've been in SoCal right now, visiting my mom, and I'm also getting ready for my qualifying exam, and I'm also teaching 2 summer school classes. So it's been very, very busy for me, I should say.
Well, tell us about what the because people don't know what that is. Like, what's a qualifying exam?
Yes. Okay. So the qualifying exam is basically kind of like this exam that you take, but it's not like an exam that a lot of people think, right? It's not like you have choices of A, B, C, D, you select one. It's basically you have a committee member, right? That has your advisors, areas of specialty that you want to specialize in. And it's just more like a conversation / drilling you to see if you really know the literature, really know your area. And as a committee, they determine if you are ready to do your dissertation. So like I am done with all my coursework, right? And now I'm going into qualifying exam mode in the fall. Yeah.
How are you feeling? Does that mean that you'll be almost done?
So after that, you'll probably need to, it's not a problem. You need to submit your dissertation proposal. And that needs to go through through a committee member again. And once that's finalized, then you do your dissertation. So I should say almost done, Almost.
You're almost. It's been a long time.
It's been a while.
There was no way to stop that train because it was too much invested.
Yeah. Once you're maybe I should stop. I'm wait, I'm too invested in this. I can't go back. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. That's so funny. All right. Well, so today we're going to talk about this new article, right?
Yes.
That you shared with us. Can you give us the title of this?
Sure. So this title is the article is titled "Unsettling Languages, Unruly Body Minds: A Criplinguistic Manifesto," and this article is published in the Journal of Critical Study of Communication and Disability. So it's a fairly new journal. I don't think that it's part of the ASHA journal series. It's housed in Adelphi University in New York.
Oh, Long Island.
Yeah.
Long Island, New York. Uh-huh.
Long Island, New York. And I think this journal was specifically centered critical studies, right? So disability studies, race, class, gender studies, honing in communication of disabilities. And one of the articles that I would like to talk about today is on something called Criplinguistics, and it's a manifesto.
There's so many questions to ask. No way. I don't want to
Yeah.
Well, the reason why I'm wondering about this is because first of all, when you do something like a critical disability studies, that makes me feel is this a discrete journal? Do you know what I mean? Is it? It is.
So it's a multifaceted kind of a thing. It can turn into critical disability studies. It can also turn into applied linguistics studies, sociolinguistics, all of those things, right? And we can also look into just disabilities in general, and they just tap into speech language hearing sciences a little bit of AAC. So it has anything that has to do with linguistics, communication, and disability. And I think it kind of touches upon race It's kind of this mesh of all these like intersectionalities coming together.
Okay. All right. And so here we are. So we're talking about criplinguistics. So let's talk. What's the definition of that?
Okay, so before we go into the article a little bit, I would like to introduce a little bit about our authors here. So this article is written by John Henner in University of North Carolina in Greensboro and Octavian Robinson in Gallaudet University. So the reason why I am taking the time to introduce you to these authors are that these authors are identifying themselves as part of the deaf and hard of hearing community. So it's such an honor to read an article where they're also considered identifying themselves as a part of that community. So, and if you look towards the end of the article, they have wrote their positionality statements, and I'll be happy to read them to you. So Octavian Robinson is a deaf, disabled, queer, trans white man. His deafness is
Why did you make this hand gesture?
His deafness is shaped by multiple forms of neurodivergence and nerve neuropathy. Despite not possessing speaking privilege, he possesses language, capital, and print literacy privileges. So it's really interesting to see Octavian's point of view as well as John Henner. John is a deaf, disabled, chronically ill, self-identified autistic person and an Ashkenazi Jewish white man. He has speech and print literacy privileges and benefits from being able to interact with hearing people using their ways of communicating. It's very interesting about these two authors is that they have identified themselves with language capital and print literacy privileges. Both of them have written that. So it's really interesting of like why they put this there. But I think the article really tells us like why these authors are putting that phrase, right? Speech and print literacy privilege, right? Language capital and print literacy privilege, I think really tells us about the issues of academia as well as the issues of communication and language that we all tend to like follow up.
I think we also don't often think about privilege in that way, right? That
Right.
literacy is a privilege to have. Like spoken speech is almost a privilege to have. It's a type of privilege. And because usually, or written, like the written literacy as well, that I think he talks about, because we are so used to that is the norm, isn't it? Right? That
Right.
everybody has to like, what are the common core standards of today's education? Like that's one of the considered essential skills, right?
Mm-hmm.
But many people cannot get access to literacy in that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or through multiple modalities. So, it's a different way to think about it. Like it's a reminder, right?
It's definitely a reminder because I think for speech therapists, it's like, of course, we know our literacy skills. Of course, we know like letter sound recognition, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's a privilege to really even be in that space or
The
to
privilege.
or to be in the position to teach that to other clients, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I do want to talk about what is Criplinguistics, right? I think Sarah, you had that was your first question. So I do want to unpack that a little bit and then kind of going into the bigger pictures of what this will look like in terms of when we're working with students with, speech and language support or clients who may need to get speech language therapy. Like it has a bigger meaning to that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So, on page 8, as always, I like to cite my pages in the article. On page 8, the authors write this, right? Criplinguistics lens on how we approach the study of languaging. So in short, we argue that no way of languaging is bad. It is okay to change your own use of language, but no way of using language should be described as atypical, disordered, or defective. So that's what Criplinguistics is saying. Just for our audience, Crip is CRIP, linguistics. And they're saying that it is a languaging. It's not a noun, it's a verb. Languaging, the act of processing language. And no process of language is atypical or disordered. That's what they're saying, right? And it continues on. It says, Criplinguistic means to critique language and language scholarship through the lens of disability, include disabled perspectives, elevate disabled scholars, center disabled voices in conversations about disabled languaging, dismantle the use of disorder and deficit rhetorics, and finally welcome disabled languaging as a celebration of the infinite potential of the body-mind. So they're trying to say that people with communication and language disorders should be re-looked at or, reanalyzed in a way that even though within their in their capacity or with how they communicate, it is how they communicate. It is not a disorder. It is not something that we should be fixing, right? It should be something that needs to be accepted. That's what Criplinguistics is kind of saying here.
So it's saying, okay, but I think like we should unpack a little bit of like what available languages are there?
Right.
Are they discussing in terms of the available languages, right? So I just want to say that like typically, John, when we say language, right, we almost typically, I'm saying we're like standard American English, Spanish, Korean is one.
Right.
We can get into the dialects of the languages, sure, right? But Russian, like these are languages, diverse like linguistic systems of different countries, and of part of our heritage. But what other types of language? Because I don't think this is a culturally responsive piece. I don't think it's about, right? It's not just about multiculturalism here. So what is he discussing in language?
So I think it's going to be really looking into, right, how languages are being understood in general, right? So how are people understanding language? And when we ask an SLP, define language, they're probably going to go into language has 5 domains. They have the phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. That's a language, right? Each languages have different forms of all those domains. But if I ask like an anthropologist, right? Or a linguistic anthropologist, if we're talking about sociolinguists, what is language? Then it's definitely going to be a different answer from all these SLPs are going to say, right? It's going to be say something like it is a shared code. It is a shared code, right? It is very rule governed upon these speakers that speech sounds should be spoken in a certain way to create words. And these words should be placed in a certain way to create sentences and meanings. And as a society, determine what is an appropriate way to say those sentences and what is not. And not an appropriate way to say. So it has that similarity between, right, phonology, morphology, syntax, but we got to really understand that this is a shared code. It is a mutually agreed upon code, kind of a thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think Criplinguistics is saying that people with communication that are different from how the society communicates, those ways of communicating are not disordered. They are not atypical. It is how they communicate as well.
Mm-hmm. So they're also including things like, I mean, I'm just making a guess, okay? I don't know.
Right. No, not. Yeah.
Like, as like a guess here, like, we're talking about like gestures, right?
Right.
Like, that should be part of language, right? And I think speech therapists call it like the multimodal approach, right?
Like, right, or the total communication approach, right?
Total communication, right? Where it's like, pointing counts, eye gaze counts, like sound, speech. It doesn't have to be speech sounds. It could just be like, to gain attention, you set a sound. Like,
Right.
So it sound, and it could also be like some signs, right? And it doesn't have to be like specifically like American Sign Language or, it could be like modified because people have different physical abilities. So like, like signing for more is going to take a little bit more fine motor, Yeah, right? Like, it's just not. So it's like if you somehow, and it's a shared understanding between like the listener and speaker, right?
Exactly.
And so it reminds me so much about like we all have students, or like I'm sure you and I definitely have students who like it's like it's like gestures very unique to the child. Do you know what I mean? Like they're attempting to sign the way that like maybe it is supposed to look like, but in that attempt, it might be like two hand claps, right? Like I remember when I was teaching her sign when she had not started speaking yet, her ability to do more was like just two hand claps. I was like, yeah.
Yeah.
She's like, and I was like, that's fine, right? And it was shared because I understood it as the listener, and she understood it as the like, what do you want to call it? The speaker, right? And so that is all language.
Yeah. Yeah, actually. That is all language. And they're all saying like no way of like language, like other ways of language, they're not bad, right? It's not atypical. It is how they communicate. And if the recipient, right, like the communication partner understands that, is that really a disorder?
Well, John, I would count. I'm going to counter argue that. No, I'm going to argue that because of what I have been taught, right? So a part of your podcast is also dismantling.
Right.
A lot of it is dismantling it's my prior beliefs of what was taught to me. And otherwise, I never questioned until I got to the day of our podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So here's where the dismantling is like, well, a huge argument that a lot of educators make is people, if they cannot be understood by multiple communication partners, then it is non-functional.
Yes, you're absolutely
right. And so that's why, like, there was a time where people were like, don't do sign, do AAC. Like, it was like an either or circumstance, right? Like, don't teach sign because not everybody knows sign.
I think there was a more push towards AAC because of that speech generating aspect where a lot of people will understand. And ASL, American Sign Language, is more like you gotta know the sign to understand what this kid is saying.
Right. And so they're looking at it from the standpoint of like getting the highest reach, if you may, right? Yes. Like getting like as many communication partners as needed as like you can to understand it. But I feel like there was a lot of danger in doing that as well, because sometimes the sign was much more effective to teach than it was to teach a grid system.
Yep.
Hell yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because the grid system required grammar. Okay. Like you have to teach like syntax too. Okay. Because think about the competencies, right? We gotta teach, right? We gotta teach the that competency that I am not remembering right now. But you know what I'm like, the navigation, operational.
Oh, yeah. Operational linguistics. Yeah, that one.
So sometimes like that's a heavier cognitive load than when like signing is much more like in real time. I could just do it. Like, you know what I mean?
And also the way how I see sign language is that it is very like natural automaticity, you know, it's happening. Like if I sign this, you already catch it, then we move on to the next thing. Right? AAC, on the other hand, I'm like, okay, I gotta do that. Linguistic competency, do I know which folder it's at? Operational, do I need to go to which file? How many pages do I need to scroll through? Right? And the strategic, like, dang, this word is not in the system, so maybe I should type it out. So there's multiple things that's happening where you sign it and it's like, okay, I understood that. Wait.
Yeah, let's just move on. So if we're talking also about communication, right? So there's language, and then there's the communication pieces of like shared understanding, joint attention, right? Like if you like, it's much more difficult to get that using an AAC system, I think, okay? Because you have to now take a break, find. If you're lucky, you might find it. Otherwise, we need to teach the strategic competence to like explain something. And it's just like so many other layers. And I also want to say like sign language can be a very multi sensory approach too. Like
Yes,
the
yes.
body movements is so much more
And
about
facial expression.
oh,
Oh,
hell
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So there was a time where that was all happening, right? Where we were like, or it might still be happening. I don't know where people are, right? I don't know, right? And I think if you were to think about it as access method, because the whole idea was that like, oh, well, not everybody knows sign and whatever, right? It's like the hands are always available, but not the device. Do you see what I mean? Is that not true?
So
I,
I
I
so one so one thing I do want to be really, really careful here is, right, especially for our listener to give more context. It is the conversation of ASL and AAC in general. There are specific cases where certain clients will need AAC, and I definitely agree. But the overall conversation about AAC and ASL tends to be that ASL is more naturalistic. It's more focusing on more of the communication aspect and the accessibility of the device versus our hands, right? So I get that in that perspective, but there will be certain cases that AAC will be more appropriate than ASL. I definitely agree. But for the purposes of our conversation, if we're just thinking about ASL versus AAC, that I definitely think it is more leaning towards accessibility here. Facial expression, level of engagement is different, right? And the message receiving and the sender process is a lot faster for sure. Yeah.
So like and also to tie it back to Criplinguistics, like that is what the author is also suggesting as well, that like all is acceptable. All these different kinds are acceptable in whichever way an individual chooses to go.
You're absolutely right. And I think so we kind of talked about criplinguistics. It's the idea that not, certain language is good and certain language is bad. It's like all type of languaging, right? It's no longer a noun, it's a verb, meaning that modalities of language, spoken, sign, grid system, AAC. We're talking about facial expression. We're talking about written language. All types of languaging is legitimate. That's what they're saying, right? And they have introduced these three specific frameworks here. And I think it's a really appropriate time to talk about that. And the authors have written that criplinguistics is necessary for analyzing human languaging, lest we produce inequities. Saying that criplinguistics perspective is reducing inequities, right? As well as it's necessary for human language. Okay. And the second aspect, the second framework is that criplinguistic recognizes that languaging is multimodal, just like what we said. And the third domain is that criplinguistic embraces disabled ways of being in producing language, including sensory, orientations, interdependence, mutual aid, and word building, care work, and the ways that time interacts with the body, mind, and language. So these are the three kind of like stances or three elements that kind of build what criplinguistics is.
Hey, well, so what type, like, well, okay, well, because it's just like when the things are described that way, it's not really that clear,
It's
right?
not really clear. So let's break it down. Okay, so the first tenet or the first item that I would like to say is that criplinguistics is necessary for analyzing human language. Okay. So that's a lot of words. That's a lot of academia words, right? So clinicians are going to be like, huh? What does that mean? So they're saying that language is not inherently disordered, although impairments may exist. Social perceptions on disability disorders. There are social perceptions on disability disorders language use. And disability in languaging cannot be separated from normative expectations of language use, right? So it is very important when we say like languaging, there's all different types of ways that people communicate. And when we think about criplinguistics, it needs to be more of like, there are different ways that people communicate, just kind of like the neurodiversity paradigm that we talked about in the first season, where it's a variation of our, perceptions and our personalities, kind of like that. languaging is done in a various mode for various people. And it shouldn't be like, oh, that mode is considered disordered, while a particular mode is considered normal or typical, right?
Mhm.
So it's that idea of that, yes, we need to accept all forms of language, but will we consider that as the norm? I think that's the thing that we should be looking into here.
Well, okay, so we should define what norm means, right? Because so like we do like norm referenced testing, right? We do norm. So like norm typically is just meaning like the large majority of people are
Correct.
doing this.
Correct. Just like the bell curve, right? The majority of the people are within the average range, right? And there's a few who are exceeding the average, and there's a few who are not exceeding the average, right? So that's what the bell curve is really saying. So when we say the norm here is, are you able to communicate orally, like verbally, right? Using your lips, teeth, tongue, vocal folds.
Mm-hmm.
And are you able to understand auditorily,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whatever I'm saying, can you interpret it without having, an additional forms to assist that? So that's what the norm is definitely saying, right? You have to be verbal, and you have to have your receptive language, your auditory, your audiological aspects, to be working functional, right? So that is what the norm is. And if you cannot do that, then you're considered as like communication disordered, right? But Criplinguistics is saying, no, that's not the case. Specifically on page 15, they say Criplinguistics is fundamentally a resistance against monomodal spoken language only policies and the belief that there is one right way to language. Yeah.
Right.
So as Goodwin, 1995, urged with Robin, a phasic man, so again, aphasia, deal with his talk and gesture as an effort to say something meaningful rather than the random movements of a disabled man. So they're saying that deal with his talk and gesture as an effort. So it's multimodal, right? We got to look at the bigger picture of not just this person's oral production. We got to look at the bigger context of how this person is communicating, right? And that falls into so many, like, it checks so many boxes of the population that we serve, right? People who are autistic individuals, right? Neurodivergent individuals. We also have people who stutter, right? People who use AAC. We have so many people that kind of checks off this box. We're going to look at this bigger picture and how is this person communicating given that context?
Well, I also feel kind of like if all languages, if everything is acceptable, right? Like we should accept all, right? Like it's kind of suggesting that there is no norm, right?
No, you're absolutely right. There is no such thing as a disordered form of language, nor there is no such thing as a typical form of language,
So
right?
if that were the case, then that also means that there is no disability, right?
So kind of going to that mindset is like, there is no disability, there is no disordered language, there is no communication disorders because everybody communicates in their own way.
So it's like communicating differently, right?
Mhm.
We're all just different.
Right.
And so I guess like I wonder, like, is the onus on the listener or the communication partner to figure out what the communication is going to be?
I think it needs to be a mutual agreement. I feel like there's also the rights and the responsibilities of both communication partners involved, right?
Uh-huh.
So the communication partner also has, the responsibility to interpret what they say, but also have the right to be like, this is how I communicate as well. And the sender, which is most likely the AAC user or the signer, should know, like, this person knows sign, so maybe I should use sign and facial expression and verbal together. Or this person doesn't know sign, so let me write things out and show it to them and gesture it out. Or if this person's if an AAC person is using the AAC, maybe I should use some of the words that are easier for them to understand, or some of the words that, more core vocabulary, because it works fluidly, So I think it kind of goes in both ways.
So the reason why I say this is because like therapy is like focused on being like, well, what type of communication can we use so that I can also understand you? And isn't that also establishing? Do you hear what I'm trying to say? Like that's kind of that is still establishing the idea of communication and right of like, yeah, I am going to accept all kinds of communication, but when I don't understand you, please use any of these other strategies so that I can understand you, because small children have not established that yet.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I honestly think so. Right. And I think it depends. Okay. It really depends how the therapist is running their session.
Okay.
Where is this therapist coming from? Is this speech therapist coming from, I got to teach them the right subject verb object?
Oh.
Is the therapist coming from, let's develop, a way for, to build effective communication together?
Yeah.
I think exactly what you said. That should be the role of the speech therapist, not, I'm going to fix your grammar for you. Oh, remember you didn't use past tense ed. That's a minus,
Mm-hmm. Well, I also kind of like wonder though, like about that literacy privilege, right? And like how kind of like morphological markers can be part of that.
Absolutely.
And grammar can be part of that, of like, I want you to get that so that you can have the highest level of access. But but that also is like kind of contradictory of a statement, because like, should the society just accept all forms of language, then it wouldn't be necessary to even work on grammar, right? Which is also further proven by, dialects. Like, like we can talk about like African American dialect, right? Like we can consider that as, we're not going to work on irregular past tense. This is a cultural difference, right?
Right.
Same thing with like actually like just any heritage, right? Like when what we hear transference between two languages, right? And so I understand. So really, you don't need to work on grammar.
Okay, but so this is why I think this is why we tend to be like, I don't know where we are, right? Sarah, yes, I definitely agree that yes, speech therapists should construct effective ways to communicate with the child so they can succeed in the schools, right? That's what the job of the school speech therapist is. How is a child going to communicate? How is a child going to access the classroom curriculum? We're developing it. Yet, we also tend to be like, I'm tapping into our translanguaging episode in season 1, where we're trying to dictate which language is superior, right? We tend to be in this like weird gray area. I think I'm saying it for all the SLPs out there. We tend to be in this weird gray area where, yes, we want to be in that space where we want to construct effective communication, but we also want to teach them like effective grammar and syntax to reach the communication competency, right? So that's where it gets a little hairy. So, and going back to what the author said, especially in their positionality statement, saying that they have that language and literacy privilege, but then in the article, they're writing that there's no different way, no languaging is bad, no form, there is no such thing as a disordered language. So that kind of gives me like, then who is right?
You know what though? But I think it's because like, how we have a tendency to think of things as a dichotomy. That's the biggest problem, right? Like it's like the earlier one, like AAC or SLP, or it's just and, right? And so it's like, I think both can exist. Like we can think like this isn't disordered language, but we are still working in therapy in what is communication.
Right. Like, you're absolutely
as a small child, like let's work on what is like a way for you and I to both understand each other, you and the world, the environment.
You're absolutely right.
Yes.
So it gets really, I think we have to really, as a profession, I think we should really move away from you have a language disorder or you don't have a language disorder. It's like, we should accept all forms of communication. If people don't understand you, let's find a way that others will. I think we should really change that narrative from you have a language disorder, you need to come see me, compared to people don't understand you. Let's find a way. Let's find a way that you can voice your thoughts. Let's find a way that you can voice your wants and needs that people will understand.
Well, there's a lot of problems with that because language disorder is not. But do you know what I mean? Like language.
I know.
Yeah, like it's not about speaking only, right? Like a language, just its articulation. There's that speech sound, but fluency. So that's a stuttering piece, right?
Yes.
And then you have like for real SLI diagnosis.
For real. This is like
you
can't move away from this. Yeah.
Language. That's language. Like that's the expressive receptive language disorder. And I feel like the IEP is to identify that as reason for academic delay, and that you will right, and that from that diagnosis, then you can receive the therapy. Where, like we might work on like syntax structures of being like, hey, like you just need this little boost to know that you have to sequence the words like this. Because that's how our education system standards are. Like,
exactly.
It's supposed to be like, you're supposed to be able to say a full sentence by a certain age. And like, so if you don't have that, then you actually are academically behind, quote unquote. Does that make sense?
Yes, because and that gives me an idea that the society, the system, the educational system really operationalized under that type of mentality of what is academic success.
Yeah.
Right? Academic success is someone who's literate, someone who's articulate, someone who is, who can convey their thoughts, in a way that, particular way, which is, this reminds me of a Discrit article that we talked about, is like, are we close to the whiteness mentality, right? Can we convey our thoughts in the closest way that we can mimic the whiteness that we can, yeah.
Sorry, no. Finish your thought. Okay.
And if you're not able to do that, instead of accepting the other forms of communication, we're trying to enforce this is the only way for you to communicate.
And that puts me into thinking a lot about this article about Criplinguistics, right? I think they basically say, this is the problem with schools, right? And like, they basically say like, this is the problem with why like you can't, if you're an ableist, then you're naturally kind of like a racist too. Remember, it was like kind of
it also like, says that in the article too. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
He's like, they say something like being anti-ableist is also anti-racist, right? Because they're like kind of like housed in the same boat. But interesting. Yeah, and then we could also talk about like how there's different accents too under that same idea of like, should we think about like the more whiteness, like our proximity to whiteness and sounding more white gives us high level of privilege, right? So grammar, syntax structure, vocabulary, accents. All right. Well, how does this impact our field though, John? I mean, I'm feeling like, let's say that, we was kind of established a little bit that like, I guess like in therapy, we're going to work on like communication repair, having this shared system of, like we could develop together this shared system of communication. But then like, what about fluency? Like, like, what about like articulation? Like, what about, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, what about, there's more. I just can't remember. So language disorder, syntax, right?
So here's the thing. I think this is a place to start, right? This article was published in 2023, which was a year ago. Now we're in 2024, right? We're now conceptualizing this idea that, hey, maybe going to speech therapy, what we're asking our clients to do is problematic. And I think identifying the issue is one step, right? I don't have the answer to what the next step will be because it's an area that we still need to develop. but I think it's a good area to kind of like understand like what is the role, right? When we're really operationalizing under what is typical language, what is atypical. And you brought up those great examples, right? Articulation. They can't say particular, let's say the R sound correctly, right? It sounds like you're a child. So maybe people may infantile at you, right? Treat you like a child. You can't say their S sound, right? So you may sound like you're not as bright as the others, right? We are already just putting people in there. What about fluency? What if students, right now, fluency researchers, I mean, there's a huge thing about fluency in the research there is either to like fully, stutter fully and be proud of your fluency, or try to use some certain techniques such as like easy onset, So there's always this type of dichotomy, the argument is always there. I feel like let's just replace fluency with language, replace language with AAC. There's always this like two sides of the argument always there.
Well, like I also like worry about my families, right? Like I don't feel like this is like a personal decision. Family-centered practice means what is a concern to the family. I work with like I'm a school-based SLP, which means that like I'm going to always work with like children or adults who are still like have supervision, like have a guardian who makes educational decisions.
Right.
And I don't feel like they are not wanting this. Like you know what I'm saying? Like I want us, like I don't feel like it's my singular decision, or is it the decision of even our industry necessarily to make? Because I think there would be families who are like, I really just want them to, just speak, like, and I feel like what we're combating here is so much bigger than our industry or education at whole, or like just special education. I think we're combating is something like sociological, like our society.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. The society, this is a societal issue, right? What is like, is Criplinguistics will be even accepted in this society right now, as probably not, right? Because we want everyone to be speaking. We want everyone to be talking, right? If you look at, the jobs of SLPs, it's like, we're hiring here, we're hiring there, because we want all of our kids to be talking. We want all of our kids to be following the norms, which is verbally communicating and understanding with our auditorial ability, right? Auditorily, right? Because these kids are not able to do that, and the society is not willing to accept it. And there are families that say, I don't want AAC, I want our kids to be working on our tech, right?
Well, yeah.
How do you, what do you say to that? Like, how do we say, look, let's, I think we kind of said this in the earlier episodes, like, I dare you to bring in discredit to an IP conversation. Not gonna fly, right? I dare you to bring in trans languaging. It's not gonna fly, because it's a societal issue to really accept that kind of conceptual idea.
I think in one of the episodes I kind of talked about this too, where like, should I even bring it up, right? I don't feel like the final decision is on me to make, right? So, because like, I feel like a big movement is to be like, okay, the parents are the stakeholders. How can we convince them? And I'm like, yo, I'm not here to convince anyone. I feel like, right? I feel like, yo, I just lay it down. I just make my recommendation. I'm like, this is just my suggestion, and this is why I think that way. But like, ultimately, I really do believe like family-centered care means like you're going with where the family feels, like whether they want to believe you or not. Like, do you say I'm not here to keep on pushing my ideas, because it's just not right. It's just not right, because that's their child. Everybody has a right to their own family beliefs and like their right, like their own decisions for their child.
I definitely agree with you because if the families want it in a particular way, we have to honor them. However, I think that it's our duty to kind of keep them up, be like, actually, research states this is an archaic thing.
Yeah.
You know, we also want to, it is part of our duty because these families aren't in the field. These families don't read the ASHA journals, nor this journal, the Criplinguistic article, right?
Yeah.
We should be also advising them, but we shouldn't be making them be like, do this now. I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
Sign the IEP now.
Yeah. Like, I'm just going to exit. I'm just going to exit services altogether because grammar is just not real. Like, it's not. But I do believe that there's some kids where I'm like, yeah, it's not a big deal. But the family, they have to do the internal work too. Does that make sense?
Because they're not there yet. They're not.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're not there yet.
Yeah.
So everything, starting from critical race theory to internalized impression to like understanding like Criplinguistics, like all of this, like that's a personal thing that you have to do on your own time. Like that each individual has to unpack for themselves, identifying your own like bias, implicit bias, like
right.
All of that work is going to impact the way that you also raise your child and how you show up for your IEP meeting and you make the requests that you make. So certainly, it is definitely the onus is definitely on us to provide the accurate, most up-to-date evidence, right? But if they are still like, no, I want my proximity to whiteness because it gives the highest level of privilege, like, what am I supposed to do then? Like, I don't feel like that's an appropriate place for me to start talking about critical race theory, right?
Right. So majority, I'm just going to let the audience know, those who've listened to the previous episodes know that we talk about like conceptual and radical ideas about our field, right?
Uh-huh.
Majority of the conversation we bring up may not fly in the IEP, right? Just being very careful here, right? May not be accepted in the IEP, nor parents will accept it because they're not there yet, or they're still bought into the academic achievement, right? And this is all we have to, and this is exactly what you mentioned, Sarah. It's like, this is kind of like the fault of the society because high GPA, like good grades equals good universities, right? And then when you get to the universities, you read things like Criplinguistics. So I'm like, isn't that a right? Right? I mean, technically, like I'm an SLP, I'm also doing my PhD, right? I worked hard to get my master's degree. I worked hard to get into this PhD. And then you read things like Criplinguistics, translanguaging. There is no L1 and L2. Like there's no superior language over the other, right? Discrit. That it is learning disability is also a form of like racist and ableist. They kind of intertwine together. So when we read these type of things, then why is the education system still perpetuating that cycle, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the society is bought into that whole whiteness, academic achievement, da-da-da-da-da. And then once you get in there, it's like everything you did was a lie. That's what they're telling you. So if it's so, then why is the education system still following this path?
Society hasn't gotten there. And you know what, John? Like, so we're going to talk more about this in the next episode, but like my own child then I found was SLD, right? And I was like, really like, okay, that's fine. So let's work on it. Do you know what I mean? Like, right. So let's get some dyslexia tutoring, right? Let's get our reading boosted up because I don't want you to fall behind. What am I talking about when I say I don't want you to fall behind? I'm talking about the academic standards for like grade 1. This is like, there's so much academic standards even for like such primary grades. Mm-hmm. But a huge reason why I feel this way about like falling behind is because the society told me, because the society is following this norm. Yes. So like if I don't keep her up, right, what would happen, John, right? It's like now we're gonna have to repeat a grade. Now she's gonna have like social impact. Now she's gonna have this, the process that like everybody has to go through as like an individual, right? Like just like what is your belief as being a member of this society, how does that impact your relationships within your community and ultimately your family? So how do I raise my own children, right? Like it has to follow. Everything is like symmetrical in with that, right? Like my own personal unpacking will match that of everything else, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so I guess just feeling like, society is not there yet, but does that mean then like we should just give up? Like, do you know what I'm saying?
Interestingly, this author have talked about time and meeting milestones, right? If you go to page 26, it says crypt language insists that crypt time in language is vital for a person's agency, be it through interpretation, translation, delayed speech, repetition, gesture, movement in gaze, and prosodic changes. Language is multimodal, interdependent, and both the user and the listener cannot be separated from the semiotic environment. And the consideration of crypt time. Have you heard of that concept before?
No.
Crypt time in crypt theory. So they're saying that there is no such thing as meeting a milestone at a certain time, at a certain age, at a certain time, because everyone's time trajectory is different. And having to follow by grade 3, you should be doing the multiplication. By grade 4, you should be learning you should be writing in paragraphs. Like that timeline is an ableist thing in the first place. And that's what they said. It's kind of related to crypt language, crypt time, where time itself shouldn't be like to indicate whether you're disabled or not.
There's so many things to say about that though, man, because like I don't think this episode is not the episode to unpack that. So let's put a button on that one though, because I really do want to revisit it, because crypt time is essentially saying that like that's how you build equity out. But that's not what Barack Obama thought during his administration. No, for real, right? Like that's not, like when you look at the Every Student Success Act, like that, the intention of that was for equity. And so it doesn't follow crypt time. But I also do understand that like you need some level of benchmarking so that you can keep teachers accountable of teaching. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But we'll talk about that. We'll put a button on that one so we could talk about it later. But yeah, like I'm just wondering, like this is a societal issue, and then should the society feel that there is a time? You get what I mean? And they're not ready for having multiple modalities of communication, and they're not ready to like build out repertoire. To some degree, I feel like it's a type of utopia that we want to achieve, of like good intentions between, right? Like this type of utopia. But I just don't feel like we're there yet.
We're not there yet. We're definitely not there yet. And I think we have to do a better job as clinicians. I think the role of the SLP should really become like an advocate.
Yeah.
Rather than making goals to say, so-and-so is going to use past tense ED. We should be advocating like this child, we should be writing goals that focuses more on like this child will communicate effectively, or the communication partner will understand,
I think that as long as it's basically saying like, as long as it's not impacting communication, that it's not really eligible to receive this additional support. Like, should it be like something that's educational? If it's an educational impact under like, because you're falling behind with the academic standards, so like that should maybe be covered by your RSP. Do you know? Like that can be covered.
Yeah, it can be. Or it can be like a joint effort, right? I kind of see it more of a joint effort.
Yeah.
Where, rather than just owning, SLP owning the grammar and syntax, it should be like a joint effort with the classroom teacher, because classroom teacher also teaches language. So
yeah.
In that broader classroom context where there's other peers, classroom teacher, one-to-one, or the classroom aide, how is this child going to effectively communicate their thoughts, answers, responses? How is that going to happen? Rather than pulling kids out, working in a small group, can kids be effectively communicating in that bigger audience?
And to go along with your idea of like SLP should be doing advocating, like we should just be like more, kind of more into the strategies, right? And building out the accommodations under your IEP so that it could it could look, and like pushing in and trying to make it happen.
Yeah.
Because you have to test out the accommodations before you write in the accommodations, right? And so, like, you can't just, like, do you need 1.5 times? Like, sometimes, like, we just throw in things there just because we've seen it so many times. But, like, we should really be, like, taking into care, like, creating this very individualized educational plan.
You're absolutely right. What is really individualized if we're just slapping things in, like, extra time for assignments, having a reader or having a note taker, like what does it really mean to be individualized in the accommodations page? For sure.
It's true. All right, John.
Well, let's wrap up this conversation. I think it really centers, this is a great article to talk about for our second season, because it kind of brings up all the articles that we talked about in the previous season together. And I think we should just proceed forward. So what does this look like from there, right?
Yeah, and so I'm really looking forward to next week's episode because, man, did I have an experience, huh, John? And I had such an experience. It was such a jarring one, considering I am in special education. So for me to be like a parent in these spaces, I was really like, wow, this really sucks. Like, should I have not been a parent who knows all the laws or systems? Like, this is an impossible navigation, okay? IDEA is an impossible navigation if you don't know it, It was hard even for me. I'm like, what is this, And so I am looking forward to that. And it also helped me unpack a lot of the things that we kind of talked about in a practical way, right? So I think we talked about it before, and like we always end our episodes the same way, which is basically like, we don't have any answers. These are all just concepts, right? These are just frameworks. But when I had to really be living it, I was like,
it's a different story. It's such a different story.
It's a different story. It really is. And again, like, I just felt like there was so many contradictions, and I don't know, but I'm looking forward to that episode. And then we have a few more coming up. We have bilingualism, I believe. Is that correct?
Let's see. Yes, we have bilingualism more in a socio-educational context. We also think about various powers that are within schools and the education system. So it kind of comes together, and I think this article was a great kickoff to talk about those.
Yeah, thanks for sharing this article, John, as always. And I loved having this conversation with you, challenging different thoughts and ideas and keeping us abreast, man, of outside of what's happening in Asia.
For sure. I'm very excited for season 2 and what we're going to talk about. So I'm excited for more conversations.
All right. Okay. Well, then have a good night. And I'll see you next time.
See you
Bye.
later. Bye.